Raeva woke to gold on the ceiling. It came the way it always came, in the hour after true dawn, when the sun cleared the eastern rooftops and found the round window above her bed, and threw its light in a slow wheel across the vaulted stone. The window was set with cloud glass greens and ambers, and one pane the deep red of a coal, and the panes were leaded in the old pattern of the descending. Figures with wings like drawn swords coming down out of a whiteness, the way the Solari had come down through the smoke on the last day of the burning world. Raeva had slept beneath them all her life, and they had long since stopped being holy to her and become simply hers. Every morning, the light came through the winged gargoyle granite window glass, and bright colors painted the ceiling in a slowly turning wheel of color, so that the first thing she ever saw of any day was her own room dressed like a festival. She lay still and let it turn, trying to fall back to sleep for a bit longer. Somewhere below her, the city was already bustling. Emberfall woke early that morning, and all at once, the gem carts could be heard below on the ash stone road with their grinding music, the criers, the bells of the temple counting out the morning offices, and under all of it, always, the low warmth that came up through the floors from the deep places where the mountain slept. The stone of the keep was never quite cold, as other castles in other cities she visited. It was known 500 years ago, and 6, that the mountain on which Emberfall was mounted had not slept, that it had poured out fire on the whole world of the first men until the sky itself went black, and that the God of Light had looked down through that darkness and would not let it be the end of men. So he sent his Solari down through the smoke and asked to gather out a remnant of the original families and carry them here, to this very shoulder of the ruin. It was they who gave the first of us the law, and shortly after left them to begin again. The Emberfall, her old nurse Debs called it, the fall of the ember, she said, the going out of the great fire, and everything since, all 500 years of kings and courts, and all the nobles of Emberfall were in some way connected to that event, and the rest, as father says, are foreigners and charlatans. Raeva did not fully believe her nurse or her father said about most things, but the Emberfall was a tale as old as time itself. Not many foreigners were permitted in Emberfall, and those that were served the king's purpose, she knew. She turned her head. On the far pillow, where a person's head would go, a grey cat lay curled with its paws tucked under, eyes shut, ears turned just slightly toward her, the unconvincing sleep of a cat that has heard every word. "Sorrel," Raeva said, "I know you're awake." The cat did not move. Sorrel was old, older than Raeva, which was a strange thing to think, that a cat could be older than a princess. Sorrel had the audacity and the cunning to act as though he owned her and everyone in the castle. He had been her mother's cat. He had slept on her mother's bed in the queen's rooms 2 floors above, until the day the queen's rooms were shut, and then he had come down the stairs by himself, one careful step at a time, and installed himself on the far pillow of Raeva's bed, as though this had always been the arrangement, and no one had ever moved him since. No one would dare. He was the last of the queen's household and did exactly as he pleased. Raeva reached over and set her hand on his side and felt it rise and fall as she pet him. "It's court today," she told him, "the real one, the great one, with all the houses. Father says I am to attend." Sorrel opened one eye, regarded her with the flat contempt of the very old, and shut it again. "You could be glad for me," she said. The room in daylight was a museum of who she had been. On the shelf beneath the window stood the wooden horse her uncle had carved for her when she was 4, its mane painted and worn away at the neck where she had held it for years. Beside it, a whole company of little cloth soldiers, faded now, a garrison she had commanded through 100 wars across the coverlet, and a doll with a fine, cracked porcelain face who had been a queen, always a queen, and had ruled the soldiers with a firm hand. There was the model of a ship that Roy's father had brought her from the coast, and a music box of cloud glass and silver that no longer played, and pressed under the glass of the box a single dried flower, gone the brown of old paper. She did not play with any of it anymore. She was 12 now, a young woman, she figured. But she had asked that none of it be taken away, and no one had taken it away, and on certain mornings she lay in the turning light and looked at all of it, and felt the strange, doubled feeling of a person who is still a child, looking back across a great distance at a child she can no longer quite reach. Most mornings had been like this once, and then one winter they had not been. She did not think about it in words. She thought about it the way she thought about the cat. Her mother had been upstairs, and then her mother had been ill, in a way no one could name or mend. The best healers of the realm and the temple's own hands laid on her, and none of it any use. And then her mother had not been anywhere, and the rooms upstairs were shut, and the cat came down the stairs. That was the shape of it. She had been 10. Her father did not speak of it. When he looked at Raeva sometimes, at a certain angle, when she laughed a certain way, something would pass across his face and then be gone, folded away, and he would smile at her and call her his precious girl and ask her what she had learned that day. On the small table by her bed stood a comb of worked silver, a river of it, with a queen's initials braided into the handle. She picked it up and turned it in the light and set it down again. Then the door opened without knocking, which meant it was the girls, and the museum closed itself. And the day began in earnest. They came in a rush of colorful skirts and noise, 4 of them, and the room that had been quiet was suddenly full. "You're not even dressed," said Nesta, who was always first through any door. Nesta Redgeld was a year older than Raeva, and never let anyone forget it. A handsome girl with too many rings for the morning, and she crossed to the great wardrobe and threw it open and began pulling gowns out onto the bed, as though the choosing of them were a matter of state. "You cannot go to the great court in your pajamas, Raeva. They'll write songs about it. The princess who came to Parliament in her sleeping things. Oh, the green. Wear the green." "The green makes her look too young," said Della, who had come in last, and settled at once into the window seat, as though she meant to stay there through the whole business. Della Morn was small, and dark, and Marsh quiet, and she said the sharpest things in the mildest voice, so that half the time you did not notice you had been cut until later. "Wear the grey with the red at the collar. It's the crown's colours. Your father will notice, and everyone will notice." She looked at her own nails. Wren had gone straight to the shelf and picked up the porcelain-faced doll and was holding it very gently, the way she held everything, as though the whole world were made of things that broke. Wren Ashford was the youngest of them and the softest, and she prayed more than the rest of them put together. And she said now, without looking up, "Let's say the morning grace before you dress, Raeva. My father says, a house that forgets the light at dawn spends the day walking in its own shadow." "Your father says a great many things," said Nesta. "He does," Wren agreed, unoffended, and set the doll down as carefully as she'd taken it up, and folded her small hands, and Raeva because she loved Ren, and because it cost nothing, and because it was true, folded her own hands too, and bent her head. And for a moment, the four of them, and the fifth who came to sit at the mirror, were quiet in the turning light. Keeper of the first fire, Ren said, "Lo, the old words, who lit the dark and did not leave us in it. Keep this house and this hour, and the ones gone on ahead of us." "Amen," they all said, even Nestor. Sorrel yawned enormously and jumped down off the bed. Then Alice arrived. Alice was always last, and always breathless, and always apologizing. And the quiet was over. I'm sorry. The corridors are packed. Every lord in the realm is in this keep this morning. I've never seen anything like it. And do you know what my father says? The wine alone is costing for the feast after? He nearly wept at breakfast. He said, she dropped her voice into a fair imitation of the steward's dry, pained delivery. We shall feed the realm's opinion of itself for one day and pay for it until harvest. She sat herself down and took up the silver comb without asking and began to work it through Raeva's hair, and the gossip began. This was the best hour of any court day, and everyone knew it, and none of them would have said so. The gowns half chosen on the bed, the comb going through her hair in Alice's quick, certain hands, the four of them talking over one another about who had come to the city and who had not, whose betrothal was made and whose was breaking, which young lord had grown handsome over the winter, and which had grown a mustache he ought to be ashamed of. They say the Sylvan envoy brought a sword to sell that sings when you draw it, and is made with elven green steel, said Nestor. They say it sings the name of whoever it kills, said Ren, wide-eyed, and touched the pendant at her throat. They say wrong then surely, said Raeva confidently, looking at the mirror before she had decided to say anything at all. The Sylvans hold no port. If there's such a blade in the city, it came by sea. She caught the four of them looking at her and shrugged. It likely costs more than Redgeld is worth either way, so we'll never have to find out, said Della from the window, not turning. Nestor threw a glove at her, and Della caught it without looking, and Raeva laughed, and Alice said, "Hold still," and kept combing. "Is it true," said Alice lower now, the way you lowered your voice for the good things, about the North? My father won't say a word about it, which means it's bad. Is it true the Dusk Boy killed Lord Orion and his son both? After the duel and everything?" The room changed a little. "It's true," said Della. She said it flatly, but she had stopped looking at her nails. "My grandfather had it a fortnight ago, before the criers, before anyone." She shrugged one shoulder. "Birds are faster than men." "Half the temple wants him hanged," Ren said very quietly, "for breaking the pact. My father says it was a sacred pact, sworn on the flame, and that to break a thing sworn on the flame is—" She couldn't quite say it. "Blasphemy," Alice supplied, comb pausing. "And the other half," said Della, "wants the Flameguard Knight hanged instead, Sir Thalon, for running." She turned from the window at last and looked at them all with her dark, patient eyes. Raeva said nothing. She was watching them all in the mirror. Alice's careful hands. "News travels fast in Emberfall," her father liked to say, and truth walks behind it the whole way and arrives to find all the seats taken. She had never understood it before. She thought perhaps she was beginning to. "There," said Alice, and set down the comb and stepped back. "Look." Raeva looked. The girl in the mirror had her mother's dark hair, brushed until it took the light, and the grey gown with the red at the collar, the crown's colours, that Della had chosen so that 400 watchers would be flattered before she spoke. She looked, she thought, like someone. She was not entirely sure who. "You'll do," said Della from the window, which from Della was very high praise. Ren took her hand and squeezed it. "You'll be wonderful. You only have to sit and watch. That's all it is your first time. Sit near your father and watch and say nothing, and it will all be over by the feast." "That's all it is," Raeva agreed. She did not know yet how wrong they both were. The Lion's Hall was the oldest room in Emberhold and the largest, and the first time Raeva walked into it, as a woman of the court, rather than a child brought to observe, it stopped her in the doorway like a hand laid flat against her chest. She had been inside it 100 times. She had run its length as a small girl and slid on the polished floor and been scolded. But she had never come into it full, and it was full now, full the way she had not imagined a room could be full, with the whole of the realm poured into one great stone vessel and set to simmer. The ceiling went up and up into shadow, ribbed with old dark beams, and hung between the beams were the banners of the houses, faded and enormous, some of them so old that whatever they had shown had gone to a ghost of itself. Highest of all, above the throne itself, hung the oldest cloth in the realm. No house's banner at all, but a plain, scorched square, brown as old blood, that the first men were said to have carried out of the burning world in the arms of the Solari themselves, and that no hand had touched in 500 years. It was the realm's whole claim to itself. We came through the fire with this, and nothing else. The high windows ran the length of the eastern wall, and through them came the morning. Orange-touched, the way the light near the crown was always orange-touched, so that the whole hall seemed lit by a fire somewhere just out of sight. The air smelled of it. The faint sulphur she never noticed anywhere but here, where the crowd's warmth and the incense from the little shrine by the door and the mineral tang of the old stone all came together into one smell. The smell of the heart of Emberhold. A smell she would have known blindfolded and dropped from the sky. And the people. She had been told there would be 60. It had not sounded like many, but 60 lords and ladies and envoys of the realm, each dressed to be seen, each attended by stewards and guards and scribes, filled the Lion's Hall to its edges and made it hum like a struck bell. She stood in the doorway and made herself do what her father had asked of her. Watch. You are my heir, and an heir who cannot read a room will not keep a throne. He has told her. So she watched, and here, at last, was a thing she could do. For Raeva had been raised on the houses of Emberfall the way other children were raised on nursery rhymes. Teachers and tutors had drilled her on banners since she was 6, laying the painted cards out on the schoolroom table like a fortune teller. Name the house, name the seat, name the story. She began at the front of the hall and read it like a page. There, nearest the dais, the grey heron of morn, standing on one leg in a silver mere, the marsh lords of the south coast, old as the stones, who had held the wet country between the rivers since the first men came down off the mountain, and who were said to know everything that moved on the umbral sea before the sea itself had decided to move it. Della's grandfather stood beneath his own banner, doing nothing at all, watching everything, his face giving back exactly as much as a shut door. Raeva looked at him, and he was not looking at her, and then somehow he was for less than a heartbeat, and something in the old dark eyes was almost, not quite, amused. Then he was looking at nothing again. Beside the heron, the iron key of Vale on its field of ledger cream, Alice's house, merchant lords, out of Sunmarket's rival stalls 3 generations back, risen to the stewardship on the strength of never once in 90 years having added a column of figures wrong. Then the broken tower of Oathcliff, grey on grey, old paint gone chalky. The sworn sword house, keepers of the eastern passes, who had beggared themselves twice in 2 centuries, answering oaths that richer houses had quietly slept through, and were poorer and prouder for it each time. And 2 banners down, close enough to Gaul, and Raeva suspected the seating was no accident. The gilded ram of Redgeld, stitched so new the gold thread flashed, a house younger than her father, made rich on wool and river tolls that had spent 10 years buying up Oathcliff's debts. The grey ash tree of Ashford, Wren's father beneath it, looking twice at his bench. The black harpoon of Saltcross on its sea-green field, the anvil of Ironwick, the silver peak of Sylvan, the mountain lords, gem miners, whose daughter, Raeva had heard this from Nestor, who had heard it from a laundress, so it was either true or gossip, had been betrothed last spring to a son of dusk, the black-starred house of Nightfall in the far north, some night named Tyven, which had seemed a fine, cold country match in the spring, and now, with the dusk's new lord, the most argued-about oathbreaker in the realm, seemed a thing House Sylvan would very much like everyone to forget. Raeva watched Lord Sylvan across the hall, standing very straight and speaking to no one. The rising sun of Orion hung too, gold on white, hung and stood unattended, with no living soul beneath it, and the hall had left a little space around it, the way you leave space around a fresh grave. Lord Orion of Dawnguard was dead in the north. His son was dead beside him. Raeva looked at the sun, with no house left under it, and felt the north, for the first time, as a real thing that killed real men, and not a story the girls told while brushing hair. The hearth and flame of Hearthfall, whose inns fed every traveller on the Molten Highway, and who knew, therefore, more road gossip than the Crown's own criers. The 3 barrels of Brandyhearth, the Vintner lords, fat Lord Brandyhearth, already beaming at everyone, having married 1 daughter to an Ashford and being at work, all Emberhold said, on a second, a man who had never met a quarrel he could not drown in a good vintage, and the crossed candles of Wickmill, wax merchants to the temple, whose lady tithed so much and so loudly that Mother Sefwin was said to wince at the sight of her. But there were more banners than she had cards for. A white stag's skull on deep blue, hung with little silver stars. That one she did not know at all, and it was beautiful and somehow cold, and the tall, still woman beneath it wore grey furs in a warm hall as though she had brought her own weather. A black bridge on gold, a green hill crowned with a single candle flame, a silver fish leaping a black wave, marsh country surely, some neighbour of Morn's, but no card of Corvin's had ever shown it. A plain sheaf of wheat, so humble among all the beasts and towers that the humility was itself a kind of announcement. She counted 24 houses in the hall, and 10 of them strangers to her. Who are you, she thought, at the stag skull woman, at the wheat sheaf lord, and what do you want? And why did no one paint you on a card? There were the elves, and there were 2 kinds of those, and even a child could see they did not love each other. One kind stood tall and pale and unhurried near the eastern windows, robed in a silver grey that seemed to hold the light a moment longer than it should, and moved as though 100 years were nothing to be spent quickly. The Isle folk, Alice had called them, the ones from the luminous realms across the Middle Sea, who had been in Emberhold for 3 generations now, and had somehow, in 3 generations, put a hand into every ledger and loan and gem warrant in the kingdom, so that people said, quietly, that half the crown's gold passed under an elven eye before it was allowed to be gold. They dealt in enchantment, and in contracts, and in patience, and they were ruinously, famously dear, and served only the very rich, and lost nothing, ever. The other kind stood apart from the first, near the southern wall, and were stranger still, the far elves, the newcomers, only lately come across the whole width of the world, from some land no one at court could point to on a map, bringing with them enchanted steel that no smith of Emberfall could match, and selling it at prices that made even the Isle folk look generous. They wore no silver. They wore black and dark red, and things that looked less like clothes than like weather, and they watched the room with a cold, faint contempt, as though human quarrels were a kind of poor theatre they had paid too much to attend. The Isle folk and the far elves stood at opposite ends of the eastern wall, and did not once, in all the hours that followed, look at one another. Raeva thought that was the loudest thing in the room. There were the dwarves and the halflings, 12 of them together in a knot near the middle. The guild folk, the ones who built the things the realm ran on. The gem vaults, the roads, the great machines under the keep that hummed all day at the edge of hearing. They were the only delegation in the hall that looked as though they had come to work, and the only ones who looked as though they were owed money and meant to say so. And there was a broad, grey-bearded dwarf at the front of them with his arms folded, and a face like a man rehearsing an argument he'd had 100 times. And there, at the very edge, in the worst place in the hall, near the door where the cold came in, 3 tieflings. Only 3. Raeva's eye went to them and caught, and stayed a moment longer than it should have. They had made themselves small, which was hard to do when you had horns, and they were dressed richly and correctly, and had clearly taken great care over it. And the care was the saddest thing about them, because it had not worked. The lords near them had drawn back a little, not rudely, just a hand's width, the width you leave for a thing you'd rather not touch. Raeva knew the stories, everyone knew the stories, that the tieflings had come, long ago, from across the umbral sea, out of the black east where the warlocks were, the deceivers, the ashmouths, the ones her nurse would not name after dark, and that though most tieflings were as good as anyone, and better than some, the horns remembered where they'd come from even when the people didn't, and the horns were enough. The 3 of them stood in the cold by the door and waited to be allowed to speak, and one of them, a woman, stood very straight and did not make herself small at all, and looked back at the lords who would not look at her. Raeva did not know why the sight of them tightened something under her ribs. She only knew that it did. She was still standing in the doorway. "Highness." The voice was low and near, and she had not heard him come up, which was strange, because she always heard everything, and he was not a small man. She turned, and it was Roy, in the white and grey of the Kingsguard, one hand resting easy on the pommel of the raven-crested, gemmed sword of his house, that everyone in the realm had a story about. And though his face was doing the still blank thing all the guardsmen's faces did in the hall, his eyes weren't in it. His eyes were kind. "Your seat's beside your father." A pause. Roy did not waste words. Her father said Roy could say more with a pause than most lords could say with a speech. "You'll do fine. You only have to see. Come on." And because it was Roy, who her father loved, like the son the flame had not given him, Roy, who had lifted her onto her first pony and taught her to fall off it without fear, Roy, whose sword she had watched flash in the practice yard until it stopped looking like a weapon and started looking like a blur, because it was Roy standing there. The fear that had held her in the door let go all at once, and she went in. She had barely reached her seat when the drum started, and the hall changed, and she forgot to be afraid. It came in from the far doors. A single skin drum walked slowly down the length of the hall, then a voice like a struck wire, singing the old ascending song that opened every great court, the one about the fire that was lit in the dark at the beginning of the world and did not go out. The whole hall stood for it. Even the far elves stood, though they stood as though they were doing the room a favor. The girl's voice went up and up into the shadow where the banners hung and seemed to catch on the old dark beams and hang there, and Raeva, standing beside her father's empty chair with the sound going through her chest, thought that if court was only ever this, she could sit through it forever. Then the song ended, and the hall sat, and out of the far door came the fools, for there were 2 of them, and the realm loved them beyond all reason for the little that they cost. The first came cartwheeling, a long, lean man in the patchwork colors of a cooling coal, red and orange and ash gray, one leg entirely black, bells at his wrists that he had somehow silenced so his tumbling made no sound, which was funnier than if they had rung. The second came behind him at a wallow, vast, soft, moon-faced, in a hat of a dozen drooping points, each tipped with a bell he had not silenced, so that he jangled the whole length of the hall like a purse falling downstairs, and tripped on nothing twice, and by the second trip the hall was already laughing. "Cinderjack," announced the herald, and Patel, and Cinderjack rose out of his cartwheel into a bow so low his nose brushed the stone, and Patel attempted the same, could not fold that far, and went over entirely, and lay where he fell, content. Then Cinderjack hauled his partner up by one ear, struck a herald's pose, and the 2 of them sang, Cinderjack high and quick, Patel booming the answers a half-beat behind, to a tune every soul in the hall had known since the cradle. "Oh, the lords are come to Emberfall, with all their silk and steel, to talk and talk and talk and talk, and eat a season's meal. They've come to save the realm, good folk. It's dangerous work and slow, for the realm's best saved from a cushioned seat, with a full cup, don't you know?" And on the last line, the 2 of them collapsed onto the front bench between 2 appalled and delighted lesser lords, put their feet up, raised imaginary cups, and toasted the whole hall. And the hall roared, because there was not a lord in it who had not ridden a week to sit on a cushion and talk, and every one of them knew it. Raeva had seen them 100 times, and it changed nothing. You knew every step of the dance and laughed anyway, the way you laugh at the tide coming in. Cinderjack was the wit, quick and cruel kind. Patel was the wall he threw the jokes against, slow and sweet and seeming witless. Between the 2 of them, there was not a lord in the room they could not open like an oyster. They did the elves first, which took nerve. Cinderjack bowed to the silver-grey islefolk by the eastern windows. "My lords of the far bright shore, welcome, welcome, and how good of you to lend us your faces. I know what your faces cost. I have seen the invoice." "What did it say?" asked Patel. "It said more," said Cinderjack. "It always says more," Patel agreed, mournful. "They'll sell you a sword that sings, my lords, sweet as a lark. And the song is the price, and the price is your song, and you'll hum it to the moneylender the rest of your days." "I bought a purse from them," offered Patel. "Did you?" "It opens by itself." Patel beamed around the whole hall. For them. And Raeva laughed with the rest and noticed the Isle folk incline their heads a precise, unbothered inch, for they had heard it before and would hear it again and would still be standing at that inch of a bow long after Cinderjack was ash. Cinderjack turned to the far elves in their weather-black, and here even he went a shade careful, bowing shorter. And our newer friends from the shore beyond the far shore, who crossed the whole wide world to bring us better steel than we can forge, and to remind us of it, so gently, so often. "Are we grateful?" asked Patel. "We're cold," said Cinderjack, "and it is hard to be grateful and cold at once." And the far elves did not so much as blink, and the hall roared the louder for the silent space where their laughter should have been. He came to Lord Redgeld, ablaze in his new gems, and did him kindly, which was crueler. "A lighthouse, my lord, I could bring ships safe to harbour by you, and every stone this year's, every stone so new, the shine's not learned its manners yet. Look at it, gawping about like a farm boy at his first feast." He leaned in, confiding to the hall. He bought the gems, he bought the coat, he bought the chair. A sly glance, 2 seats down, at grim old Oathcliff in his ancestral steel, worn thin at the elbows. "He's tried to buy the seat, but it seems the seat's not selling yet," said Patel gravely, and old Oathcliff's jaw went to iron, and Redgeld laughed too loud and half a beat too late, and half the hall did not laugh at all, but looked at its own hands and smiled the way men smile at a thing too true to cheer. They found fat Lord Brandyhearth next, who had begun laughing before they even reached him, which was wisdom. "My lord of the 3 barrels," cried Cinderjack, embracing as much of him as one arm could. "The realm's great peacemaker. He has never lost a war, my lords, for he has never let one start sober. No feud in Emberfall can survive 3 cups of his autumn red." "There is no guest in Emberfall that can survive 3 cups of his autumn red," said Patel from experience. And Brandyhearth laughed until the bench complained beneath him and shouted that the fools drank free at his table forever, which proved the point so perfectly the hall laughed twice. They passed the black bridge banner of a Lord Raeva did not know, a lean, sour man in gold-trimmed black, and did not stop, only slowed, and Cinderjack fished in his motley, produced a single copper, and paid it solemnly into the man's astonished hand before walking on. "The toll," he explained to the hall sadly. "Bridgemill charges to cross. I go in fear he'll charge to arrive." And the sour lord went the colour of his own trim, while half the hall laughed the knowing laugh of men who had paid that copper many times and hated it every time. So that is Bridgemill, Raeva thought, and put the black bridge away in its place. Then the fools drifted, wandering innocent, into the wide, empty channel of floor between the talon of Talonpool and the bastard red talon of Falcon's Throw, and stood in it and looked from one house to the other. And Cinderjack said, wondering, "Strange, warmest hall in the realm, and the draught runs straight down the middle." Patel licked one finger and held it up, testing the air, frowning gravely at each house in turn. And both delegations glared at the fools, at each other, and the hall howled, and not another word was needed. And then Cinderjack did the boldest thing of the morning. He stopped before Lord Sylvan, high-collared, straight-backed, speaking to no one Lord Sylvan, and simply looked at him in silence for a long, long moment, while the whole hall held its breath around the one subject that could not possibly be touched. And then he recited delicately, to the ceiling. A mountain lord had gems to spare, and a daughter sweet to wed. He looked all south, the weather fair, then looked north instead. He let it hang, one heartbeat, long enough for the hall to feel the cliff's edge under it, then spun away with a flourish. A fine match. Northern men are famous keepers of their word. And the hall's laughter came out half a shriek, the wild, relieved laughter of a room let back from an edge, and even Lord Sylvan, to the eternal credit of his house, closed his eyes and let one corner of his mouth surrender. Raeva laughed behind her hand, heart going quick. He is the only man in Emberfall who is allowed to tell the truth, she thought, and they pay him in bells. He did, Lord Ashford. Who'll give you his answer the very moment he's certain, my lords, and he'll be certain any year now. Hold fast. And mild Ashford chuckled and nodded as though it were a compliment, which somehow made it land twice. He did the steward, Alice's father, who sat to the side of the dais with the crown's ledgers, and this was the one the hall had been waiting for. And there, said Cinderjack, dropping his voice to a reverent hush, pointing, there sits the man who makes the king rich, and it pains him, you can see it. It pains him every hour of his life to spend a mark. He'd charge the sun for the light it leaves on his floor if he could find where to send the bill. And the steward, to his great credit, only closed his eyes briefly, like a man in prayer. And then Pattle, who had drifted down toward the cold end of the hall, near the tall eastern windows, near the three tieflings by the door, stopped. He was looking out, past the rooftops, at the far grey line of the umbral sea. And when he spoke, his sweet witless voice had gone sing-song and strange, and not to anyone. The mist comes creeping, soft and slow, over the water where the great lords won't go. It ate a village, it ate the light, and it's hungry still, and it feeds by night. For one breath, the lion's hall held no sound at all. A bench creaked somewhere. Raeva felt the hair stir on her arms and could not have said why. It was only a fool's rhyme, only nonsense. Yet the three tieflings by the door had gone very still, and across the hall, Lord Morn had lifted his shut-door face and was looking at the fat fool with something that was not amusement in the least. Pattle! Cinderjack's voice cracked bright across it like a driver's whip. Pattle, you enormous sad pudding! No one came here for your weather. Give them a wedding. A wedding! Pattle brightened at once, the strangeness gone as if it had never touched him, and the hall let out its breath in a laugh that came just a shade too fast, too grateful. And Raeva laughed with it, and tucked the cold thing away somewhere without noticing she had done it. Then Cinderjack came to the young lords, and Raeva's face went hot before he'd even opened his mouth, because she knew exactly where this went. And here he sang, sweeping an arm along the front benches where the sons and heirs of the realm sat arranged in their finery, the flower of Emberfall, the future, my lords, gaze upon it and take heart. This one, a boy of 15, who sat up very straight, has been practicing that very bow in his mirror since springtide, and it's nearly ready. And this one, a tall lord's son, gone rigid with dread, has been told by his father he is very promising, which, my lords, is the cruelest thing you can call a man before he's done anything at all. And he went down the whole row, and not one was spared, and every one of them was a boy the girls traded gossip about, and Raeva bit the inside of her cheek and was not entirely successful. And then he stopped, and turned, and found her in her grey gown, with the red at the collar, in the seat beside the king's, and the whole hall's eyes came with his. "And there," said Cinderjack, and for the first time all morning his voice went entirely soft, "there sits the fairest thing in all the realm, and it is not close, my lords, it is not a race, it is a rout, the Princess Raeva. And I say to every gallant sprat along this bench, look and despair, for not one of you is fit to fetch her horse, and you know it, and I know it, and forgive me, she knows it, which is worse." The hall was warm with laughter, and every face was turned to her, and she was scarlet to the ears and could not stop smiling. "Wed the princess, any of you, I dare you." The boys had discovered something fascinating on the floor. No takers, a whole bench of Emberfall's finest, and not one dares. She'll make do with fools then. And Patel, huge and gentle, came and knelt. It took him some doing to get down, and held up in one enormous hand a single ember bloom, the ash flower that grew only on the crown's lower slopes, red going to gold at the petal's edge like something slowly burning, and the whole hall watched, and Raeva took it from him. "Highness," said Cinderjack quietly, "just for her, all the clown gone out of him for one heartbeat. Your mother laughed at me once, in this very hall. You've the very same laugh. It's the best thing I ever did in this life, making her laugh. I hope you'll let me try for yours a while yet." And then he was up and grinning, and the clown was back, and he spun to the throne where the king had been sitting through all of it, unmocked, the one man in the realm Cinderjack had not touched, and the hall held its breath, because everyone knew, everyone had always known, that the king must not be mocked. "And last," said Cinderjack, "the king." The hall went very still. "I shouldn't," said the fool. "You mustn't," breathed Patel, appalled and delighted at once. "His grace is sacred. His grace is the flame's own anointed. His grace could have my head." He crept toward the throne, on his toes, wincing as at a great heat, and stopped and considered the king a long moment and gave up. "I can't. There's nothing wrong with him. 20 years I've mocked this court, and 20 years I've stood before this throne and found nothing. The man has no vices. It's the rudest thing about him." "He's old," offered Patel helpfully. "He is not old. He fell asleep at my juggling." "Everyone falls asleep at your juggling, Patel. The torches fall asleep at your juggling." And then Cinderjack stopped and turned back to the throne and pointed at the king with sudden triumph. "There it is. 20 years, my lords, and I have found the king's one crime at last. He drew himself up like a herald. He has kept the same fool for 20 years, cheapest man in Emberfall." And King Tybalt threw back his head and laughed. He laughed longer and louder than any man in the hall, a young man's laugh out of an old man's chest, and because the king laughed, the whole hall was let laugh too, and it roared, and the two fools bowed to the four corners and were gone. Cinderjack soundless, Patel jangling and tripping once more at the door for the pure love of the craft, and the drum went out with them, and the singer and the warmth of them hung in the air like smoke. Raeva sat with the ember bloom in her hands and looked at her father laughing. And her father, still laughing, turned and looked at her, at the flower, at her mother's laugh on her own face, and went quiet a moment in the middle of all that noise. He reached over and touched her hair once, the way you touch something to be sure it's real. "Well, daughter," he said, only for her, under the noise, "now the fun's over. Now you'll see what it's actually for." And he faced front, and the laughter died down the hall like a wave going out, and his voice, when it came again, was not the private voice at all, but the other one, the great one, the one that filled the lion's hall to its dark beams without seeming to rise at all. "Steward," said the king, "open the floor." Lord Vile rose, and the court began, and it was nothing at all like the fool. It was slow, and it was ordered. Lord Vale stood with the Crown's ledger open before him and called the houses one at a time, greatest first, and each lord rose when named, said his piece, and sat. No one shouted over another. No one spoke out of turn. Raeva had expected something like a market square and found something like a right instead, and she noticed within 3 speakers that the lords rarely said outright what they wanted. They asked for one thing and meant another, and the whole hall knew it, and answered the meaning rather than the words. "The Lord of Oathcliff," said the steward, "you have the time." And old Oathcliff rose in his plain sworn steel and said that an oath was an oath. He did not raise his voice. He said that the realm was built on things sworn, that the pact at Zenith Falls was sworn on the flame itself, and that a knight of the Flame Guard, Sir Thalen, had abandoned his post in the north when his oath said stand, and that a realm which did not hang a man for breaking his oath was a realm that had decided its oaths were suggestions. He sat down. It took him less than a minute, and it landed like a stone in a well. "The Lady of the Temple," said the steward, and Raeva watched a woman rise whom she had not marked before, grey-robed, sharp-faced, older than the king, Mother Sephen, who spoke for the Ashen choir, and who did not, Raeva noticed, argue with Oathcliff at all. She simply moved the ground he was standing on. A knight of the Flame Guard, she said mildly, was sworn first to the flame and only second to any lord of earth, and if the boy Thalen had judged, in the north, in the dark, that his oath to the flame forbade him to die for a broken and blasphemous pact, then the question of his desertion was not the Crown's to settle at all. It was the Temple's. She would thank the court to remember whose knight he was. And she sat, and Oathcliff's stone sank without a ripple, and Raeva thought, she did not answer him. She took the whole thing away from him and never once said no. "The Lord of Ashford, you have the time." And Wren's father rose and was cautious, exactly as cautious as the fool had made him, and said that whichever way the Crown ruled, it should rule quietly, and soon, because the North's disorder was creeping south along the trade roads, and a caravan out of Dawnguard had been robbed on the Molten Highway not a fortnight past, and merchants who feared the roads did not travel them, and a realm whose roads emptied was a realm going quietly to clinker whatever it decided about 2 boys in the north. He looked twice at the bench before he sat back down on it. "The Lady of Saltcross, you have the time." And a woman rose whom Raeva did know, for everyone knew Saltcross, hard and salt-cured, her skin weathered to tack leather by 40 years of eastern wind, in a gown of oiled sea wool, the grey-green of a wave about to break, with a single barb of old black iron pinned at her throat. The head of the harpoon her great-grandmother had put through the last Raider King of the Strait, worn now as a brooch and as a promise. The Saltcrosses held the narrow water where the umbral sea pinched between the capes, and every ship that wished to pass paid them for the mercy of it, which had made the house rich and hated in equal measure. There were captains up and down the coast who swore the family still hung false lamps on foul nights and split whatever broke on the rocks. Raeva did not know if that was true. Looking at Lady Saltcross's face, she thought it might be, and thought too that she would sooner have such a woman at her wall than beyond it. She did not stay long on her feet. The eastern coast was uneasy, she said. in a way a fisher's daughter learns young to fear. The deep water boats coming in early and saying little, fog where fog had no business lying. And twice now lamps on the black water at night that answered no signal she knew. She asked the crown for nothing yet. She wished only that when the tale reached the throne by slower roads than hers, it be remembered that Saltcross had said it first. And she sat. The Lord of Merrybourne, you have the time. And the silverfish banner gained its house. And Raeva leaned forward a little, because here was one of her strangers speaking. He was a young lord, younger than any who had risen yet, sun-browned and wind-chapped, in good wool-cut plain, and boots that had been fine once, and had since met a great deal of salt water. A man dressed by a house that had money for one thing at a time, and chose the boats. Merrybourne, it emerged as he spoke, held the fishing weirs and eel marshes east of Morn's country, sworn to Morn's protection, since some flood or war too old for him to bother naming, and he rose only to say plainly and a little too fast, the way men speak who are not used to halls, that whatever the wiser lords made of Lady Saltcross's fog, his own weirmen had begun refusing the night tides. They're not timid men, my lords. My grandfather drowned 3 of their grandfathers just teaching them the water. A grim young flash of a smile, gone at once. They'll take an eel from under a storm. They will not go out past the mist line after dark, not for wages, and I have stopped asking them to. He sat down, red-eared at his own boldness, and old Lord Morn inclined his head to the young man, the smallest measure, and Raeva marked it. Morn had not yet spoken a word this morning, and his piece was being said all the same. The Lord of Fallowfield, you have the time. The wheat sheaf, and its lord was old, and looked, Raeva thought with a small shock, hungry, a big frame gone loose in its skin, a good coat, brushed shiny at the elbows, the only lord in the hall wearing last year's fashion, because it was last year's coat. Fallowfield held grain country in the southern reach, and Lord Fallowfield had come, he said in a voice like a dry field, to say a plain thing plainly, 2 summers without rain. The 3rd planting was in the ground now, and the ground was dust to the knuckle. His granaries had fed half the south in lean years past, and his granaries were empty, and if the light did not send rain by midsummer, the crown should know now in the spring, while knowing could still be useful, that the south would be buying grain by harvest. Buying it, he said, with a slow look across the hall at the amused red-robed envoy from the southern dominions, from whoever cared to sell it. And he sat, and the red envoy smiled faintly at the middle distance, and Raeva felt something she had never felt in her life, which was the realm itself as a body that could hunger. The House of Crowbank, you have the time. A dark-suited lord rose, whom Raeva half knew. She had seen the crow-on-coin banner over a fortified counting house in the lower city all her life without ever thinking of it as a house, sleek, precise, in black wool, of a quality that did not glitter because it did not need to, a jet pin at his throat, his one ornament. The Crowbanks were lenders, the great human lenders of Emberfall, old money that had once been new 3 centuries before. Redgeld made the same climb. And Lord Crowbank had come, he said smoothly, in a voice made for the reading out of terms, only to observe what the guilds had already observed, that coin lent from across the sea came with patience no honest Emberfall lender could match, for my house must eat within a mortal lifetime, my lords, and theirs need not, and that a realm which let all its debts drift into hands that could wait 100 years for repayment might one day discover it had sold something it had not known was on the table. He bowed to the isle folk as he said it, with perfect courtesy, and the Isle folk bowed back with perfect courtesy, and the hatred between the two bows was as clean and bright as new ice. He is not warning us because he loves us, Raeva thought. He is warning us because they are winning. Then the steward called a name that made the hall go curious. The Lady of Emberfall. You have the time. And the woman under the stag skull banner rose, and Raeva finally had her stranger, the tall, still lady in grey furs, who had brought her own weather. Emberfall. The name placed the house at the very hem of the realm, far south and east, where the land ran out into cold uplands facing the open sea, a seat so remote that Meister Corvin had never made a card of it, and the hall's murmur said most of the lords knew little more. She was neither young nor old. Her furs were silver grey, her gown beneath them the deep blue of her banner, and worked into it in small white gems were stars. Actual stars, Raeva realized, true constellations, the winter sky rendered in stones. And when she spoke, her voice was low and unhurried and carried to the beams. Emberfall, she said, had kept the far watch since before the realm had a name for it. Her house did not come north often. The north rarely said anything her house had not already read in better sources. She paused, letting the hall decide whether it had been insulted, and continued before it could. Her people were watchers of the sky. It was all their poor cold country was good for, she said, and the hall laughed uncertainly, unsure if it was a joke. And for a year and a half now, the stars over the eastern water had been wrong. Not moved, a star did not move, dimmed, veiled on clear nights in a belt low over the umbral sea, as though something hung in the far air too thin to be cloud and too constant to be weather. Her stargazers kept records going back 11 generations. Nothing in 11 generations matched it. She did not know what it meant, and she would not pretend to. She had brought the charts. She would leave them with the crown's maesters, and she resumed her seat with the unhurried finality of a woman who had said the thing she crossed a realm to say, and cared not at all what the hall made of it. The hall, being a hall, made nothing of it. The murmur closed over her strange, cold report like water over a stone, and the next speaker was already rising. But Raeva sat very still, because a thing had just connected itself to a thing. Unbidden, in the back of her mind, mist below on the water, and a veil above among the stars, and a fat fool's rhyme about something hungry that fed by night. And she did not want the connection, and could not unmake it, and looked at her father, and her father's half-lidded eyes were resting on the Lady of Emberfall's charts, where they lay rolled in her steward's arms, and were not sleepy at all. Raeva's eye went on from her, house to house across the crowded floor, the way it had gone all morning, snagging on the Iron Lord of Ironwick, black-bearded and enormous, an ancestral war maul slung across his back that no other man at court could have lifted, let alone swung, whose people dug the ore that armed half the realm, and who was owed coin by nearly every soul in the room and had forgotten none of it, and past him to the stranger at the hall's edge she had puzzled at since the doors opened, an envoy of the southern dominions in a robe cut close and imperial red, olive-skinned, clean-shaven, and faintly, permanently amused, come north to speak of a treaty of grain and roads, who had watched Emberfall quarrel with itself all morning, with the patient look of a man appraising a horse he means to buy cheap. Half the great houses hungered for the South's grain. The other half would starve before they owed the South a favor. Raeva knew only that the amused Red Envoy had not once stopped watching, and that men who watched that closely were seldom in a room for grain. and so it went. A dusk kinsman rose. Raeva did not know him, a hard northern man in salt-stained grey, some cousin of the boy everyone wanted hanged, and said, in the flat grinding accent of nightfall, that the pact had been answered in blood in the old honest way, that Lord Dusk had died in that duel by Orion's own hand, and no one south of the frost had wept for him, and that if Orion's sworn swords could not hold what their lord had bought with his life, that was Orion's failing and not the Dusk Boy's crime, and the North would thank the soft South to keep its verdicts to itself. He sat in a hall gone cold and muttering, and Lord Redgeld was on his feet almost before the Northman's weight had settled, and here Raeva watched a man perform. Lord Redgeld, whose gems were new and whose name was newer, rose and was pious, loudly, magnificently pious, and demanded in ringing tones that the blasphemer be hanged, that the realm show the flame it had not gone soft, and all the while his eyes went not to the king, and not to the north he claimed to grieve for, but sideways, again and again, to the grey-robed woman and the old houses watching him do it. Raeva watched his eyes go sideways and thought of him, laughing too loud at the fool, too eager both times, and felt something like pity and something like disgust, and did not yet have the words to tell them apart. Then the Isle folk spoke, and they did not rise so much as they were simply suddenly standing, silver-grey and unhurried, as though they had stood the whole time, and the room had only now agreed to notice. Their envoy, Malus, spoke neither of the pact, nor of oaths, nor of the flame. He spoke briefly and warmly of friendship, of how greatly his masters valued the long peace between the crown and the luminous realms, of their confidence in Emberfall's prosperity, of their earnest wish, in a hard and worrying season, to see that friendship shown before the whole assembled realm. He said it so smoothly, and said so little, that the hall murmured and moved on, almost before he had finished, and thought no more of it. Raeva thought no more of it either. She would remember later that she should have. The Far Elves said their cold peace. They wished it known that if human lords bought far-shore steel and then used it to murder one another in the north, that was the buyer's affair, and not the smith's, and they would thank the court not to let the reputation of their craft catch the disorder of its customers. The dwarf rose, Master Braca, of the Deep Works Guild, whom Raeva knew by sight, the way all Emberhold knew him, for he had stood waist-deep in every great digging of her lifetime, and his hands were so scarred and stone-split that lords who would not dine with him still crossed rooms to shake them, and was blunt and said the crown owed the guild for 2 years' work on the lower vaults and the roads it was so worried about, and that it was a fine thing to argue about honor for a whole morning while the men who actually built the realm went unpaid, and that furthermore, the Isle folk were pricing honest guild work out of every contract in the city, and someone ought to say so, and he had. He sat to scattered, uncertain applause. And last, because the steward called them last, in the worst place in the room, near the cold door, the tieflings. The woman spoke, the one who had stood straight. Sabra, the steward, named her, of a house Raeva did not know. She did not plead. Raeva had braced herself for pleading, and there was none. In a low, clear, steady voice, the tiefling woman said that with the north in disorder, and fear loose in the realm, and the old dark east across the umbral sea, rising again in every fireside tale, she had come to court to say one thing plainly and be done, that her people had crossed that sea to flee the Black Tongues, not to serve them, that they had bled for Emberhold in wars these very lords could name, and that when frightened men went looking for a devil to blame, it was an old and easy and shameful habit to look first at the ones with horns. She asked nothing. She only asked to be looked at, and she stood there and let the hall look at her, and the lords near the door drew back their hands' width and did not. But Raeva looked and could not have said why her eyes stung. And across the whole width of the crowded hall, the tiefling woman's steady gaze found the girl in grey beside the throne, the only face in all that room turned fully toward her. And something passed between them, quick and wordless, and the woman inclined her head once, the smallest bow, and Raeva, not knowing what else to do, inclined hers back. She felt her father see it. She did not turn to check. The arguing went on. It doubled back and knotted and rose, and Oathcliff and Redgeld nearly went at each other over the word blasphemy until the steward's staff came down once on the stone. And through all of it, the king sat and said nothing, hour on hour, his chin on his fist, his eyes half-lidded, letting the great room shout itself hoarse and empty. Raeva thought at first he had gone to sleep. Then she caught the glint under the lids and understood that he was waiting, that the whole roaring parliament of Emberfall was talking itself, one lord at a time, into a shape her father had perhaps foreseen from the moment the doors opened. High above, in the eastern windows, where the orange light came in, a raven landed on the sill. It was a small thing. No one else marked it. It settled and folded its wings and cocked its head and looked down at the whole shouting hall with a black, considering eye. And Raeva looked up at it and thought only that it was strange for a bird to come to a window with so much noise below, and did not think about it again. High on the northern gallery, where the shadows of the beams pooled thickest, a woman she did not know and would not have marked sat very still, and did not look up at the bird at all, which was itself a kind of looking. News travels fast in Emberfall. Raeva looked back down at the hall, and the flower was warm in her hands, and she did not understand the half of what she'd seen. But she was beginning, she thought, to feel the shape of the thing under it. The way you feel the mountain under the stone, even when it's quiet, even when you've stopped noticing the warmth. There was a thing moving under this room. She could not name it. She only knew it was there, and that it was old and patient, and that not even her father, who was the king, seemed entirely to be its master. Then the king lifted his hand, and the whole hall fell silent, all at once, as though a door had shut. "A son," said King Tybalt, into the silence, "is not the keeper of his father's oaths." He had not risen. He did not need to. He let the sentence sit in the great quiet room until it had reached every corner. The pact was made in the north, across the water, at Zenith Falls, he said, and it was answered there, in the old way with a blade, before any of us had a word to say about it. Lord Orion fought his duel and won it. Lord Dusk died on the field, and I will hear no man in this hall pretend he wept. His eyes moved, unhurried, along the front benches. But a duel wins a man his mourning. It does not win him his house. And if the sworn swords of Orion could not hold, in the days that followed, what their lord had bought with his own blood, then I will not hang a boy for taking it back. A pause, waited, final. That is not blasphemy. That is war. And we have all of us known, since the first snow, that the North would end this way. I'll not call a boy an oathbreaker for finishing a thing his elders started and could not finish on their own. Down the hall, Oathcliff's jaw set, and the temple's grey-robed woman folded her hands, and the northern dust cousin looked at the floor, and Raeva watched the whole room absorb a single sentence and rearrange itself around it, and understood at last what her father had been waiting for. He had let them empty themselves so that when he finally spoke, there would be nothing left in the room to answer him with. As for the flame-guard knight, the king went on, and here the faintest dry weariness came into it. The lady of the temple is right, and it costs me nothing to say so because it costs me his verdict. Sir Thalon is the flame's knight, not mine. Let the temple weigh its own. I'll not do the choir's hanging for it, and take the blame besides. Mother Sephwin inclined her head a precise, satisfied inch, and Raeva thought, he gave her a thing she wanted and got rid of a thing he didn't want, in one breath, and made it sound like humility. And the North is not finished with us, said the king, for all that we would like it to be, which brings me to the part of this morning I have least looked forward to. A dry twist of the mouth. Orion is dead, and Orion's son is dead, and so, the flame help us all, the house of Orion and the seat of Dawnguard, and everything that goes with it, falls this morning to Orion's brother. He let the hall wonder. Bartholomew Orion, whom some of you will remember. A ripple went through the older lords, and one or two of them laughed before they could stop themselves, and the king almost smiled. I see the men old enough to know him. Yes, the very one. Last I had word of Bartholomew Orion, he was drinking his way through the low quarters of Brightford, 3 sheets to the wind, and owing money to worse men than any in this room. And if the old lecher still draws breath, and he has outlived better men than me by sheer stubborn refusal to be useful, then he is one of the great lords of Emberfall this morning, and did not know it when he woke, and is likely not awake yet. The hall laughed properly now, the tension of the whole long morning breaking loose in it, and the king let them. Find him, said the king, and it was not to the hall any more. It was to a northern lord, near the front, quiet and precise. Find me Bartholomew Orion, send south for him, and bring him to me, and a flame keep whoever you send, sober him on the road, if you can manage it. The lord bowed. The king leaned back. We'll take the rest of the north up another day. We've been sorry about it long enough for one morning, and the wine's been paid for. Steward. The court is closed, said Lord Vale, and struck the floor. And before the first bench could scrape, the drum came back. It came slow up the hall, as it had come that morning, and behind it, the singer in Greyhaven blue, and 2 more singers with her now, a deep-voiced man and a boy whose voice had not yet broken. And the hall, which had half risen, sat back down, because no court of Emberfall ended until this ended. The drum found the old walking beat, the beat of feet on ash, and the girl's wire-bright voice lifted into the dark of the beams. When the world was fire, and the sky was black, and the sea boiled white on the shore, the light looked down through the burning dark and said, "There shall be more." The man's voice came in under hers, low as the warm stone. Down came the wings through the choking smoke, down to the dying lands, and they gathered us out of the ember field and carried us in their hands. And then the boy, high and clear and alone, and Raeva felt it lift the small hairs of her arms. They gave us the law on the cooling stone. They gave us the grain and the flame, and they went away up the morning sky and left us only a name. And the last verse belonged to no singer, because the last verse belonged to everyone. The hall came into it the way the tide comes in, 60 lords and their stewards and their guards, Oathcliffe's cracked growl and Brandyhearth's happy roar, the Talonpool benches and the Falcon's Throw benches singing the same words at each other across their 60 years of hatred. Lady Saltcross with her chin up, the young Lord of Merriborn red-eared and loud, the dwarves of the Deep Works pounding the beat on their knees, her own father's voice under all of it like a keel. And Raeva sang too, the words she had known before she could remember learning them. So sleep, great mountain, hold your fire, and dream beneath the snow. For we are the sparks you could not kill 500 years ago. The drums stopped. The last word went up into the banners and hung there, up where the scorched square of the first men hung, and for one breath the whole quarrelsome realm stood silent together beneath the oldest thing it owned. Raeva looked down the hall, through a blur she was not going to acknowledge, at all the houses that hated and owed and feared and outbid one another, singing themselves one people for the length of a verse, and understood in her chest what no card of Maester Corvin's had ever taught her. This was the realm, not the borders, not the throne. This, the fire remembered together. It held them the way the mountain held the city. Then someone laughed, and someone called for wine, and the hall broke like a wave. All at once the terrible, slow weight of it lifted, and it was 60 lords and their circling worlds turning toward the great doors and the banquet hall beyond, the whole realm's opinion of itself pouring out to be fed at last. Raeva rose with the rest, the flower still in her hand, her heart still going from the king's one hand lifting and the whole room falling silent, and she felt Della's eyes on her from across the emptying hall, and turned and found her small dark friend already looking, already knowing, the way Della always somehow already knew. Della glanced at the king, who had not risen. She glanced at Lord Morn, her grandfather, who had also not risen, and at the man in gems edging toward the dais, and back at Raeva, and she did not come over. She understood before Raeva did that Raeva was not coming to the feast. Della only lifted one shoulder, so it begins for you too, and let the tide of skirts and lords carry her out toward the wine, and was gone. And the great doors boomed shut, and the Lion's Hall emptied of its 60 and its noise, until there was almost no one left in all that vast orange-lit space but the king and his daughter, and the silent white shape of Roy at the foot of the dais, and 2 lords who had not gone to the feast. The hall, in its emptiness, was a different room. The banners hung enormous and still, and the morning had climbed higher in the eastern windows, so that the orange light had thinned to something clear and gold and nearly kind. Raeva stood by the throne, small in all that space, and did not understand she had been kept back on purpose until the king said, without looking at her, "Stay, Raeva. There is a court the court never sees, and it is the only one that matters. Sit by me and watch." She sat on the step below the throne, with the ember bloom still in her hand, and for a little while, before the lords came, it was only the 2 of them and Roy's silent white shape at the foot of the dais, and her father looked down at her with the tiredness he never once let the hall see. "You did not fidget," he said. "I was thinking about the fools," Raeva admitted. "So was most of the room. The rest were thinking about you." He touched the flower with one finger. "There will be a dozen letters on my desk by week's end, from fathers with promising sons. I intend to enjoy refusing every one of them." "Even the one who is very promising," she said, and surprised herself, the words out before she had thought about them, and her father laughed, a real short, private laugh, and she felt it drop into her chest, like a coin let fall a deep well, the good, far-off sound of having made him do that. Especially them, said the king. Then the doors opened at the far end of the hall, and the warmth went out of his face, the way it goes out of a room when a window is thrown wide, and the lords came up the long floor toward the throne. Lord Vile came first, the ledgers still under his arm, for a steward's day did not end when the court did. Behind him came Lord Lorin, the master of coin, smooth and well-made in a dark coat with the crown's badge at the collar, wearing the easy, ready smile of a man who has never once in his life been caught at anything. Then grim Oathcliff, in his worn steel, who had not gone to the feast, because Oathcliffs did not feast while there was trouble in the realm. And last, unhurried, Lord Morn of the Marsh, his face the same shut door it had been all morning, and something coming up the hall with him that Raeva felt before she could name it. A coldness, a weather, blown in off some far coast. They made their bows. The king spent no breath on greetings. Morn, you held your tongue the whole morning, and I have known you too long to think you did it for nothing. Speak. And Lord Morn spoke, and the little he said was worse than a great deal. The mists are rising, your grace. His voice was low and level, a man reading a tide line off a stone. All down the umbral coast, thicker than any man now living has seen them, and further west than they have any right to reach. My watchers mark them a full day's sail, past the old bound, come creeping toward the shore, where in my grandfather's time they clung out in the deep water off the wardwood, and no nearer. A pause. And where the mist comes, other things come in behind it. There have been raiders, boats with no colors, off the eastern shore, in the fog, and gone again by first light. Fishwives, fog, and driftwood pirates, said Lorin lightly, before the king could so much as draw breath. Forgive me, my Lord Morn, but the coast has feared that mist since our grandfathers' grandfathers, and every hard season it finds afresh. A village was burned, said Morn. The words dropped into the great room and stopped it dead. South of the wardwood, 9 nights passed. They came in the fog, and they went in the fog, and they left it burning behind them. And my ally on that coast rode down and counted the dead with his own hands. Morn's shut-door face did not so much as flicker, and somehow that was the worst of all of it. 13, your grace. 4 of them were children. Raeva felt the whole warm room tilt under her. She had not meant to picture it, and could not stop. A village she had never seen and never would. Small houses of the kind she had ridden past 100 times without once looking at them. And the fog, and men with no colors walking out of the fog, and children, 4 of them. No older than the pages who carried her father's cup at supper. Something rose in her throat that she had no court face ready for, and her eyes went, without asking her leave, to Roy, and found him already looking at her. He did not speak. He only shifted his weight, half a step, so that he stood a little more squarely between her and the great doors and the whole darkening world beyond them, and settled again, as though he had merely grown tired of his old footing. It was nothing. It was everything. She pressed the ember bloom in her fist until a petal bruised soft against her palm, and made herself sit still, because her father had said sit and watch, and because every soul in that room was a great lord of the realm, and she was 12 years old, and she would not be the one who wept. Oathcliff's hand came down hard on the arm of no chair, for he was already on his feet. Then the crown answers it. Ships to that coast steal into the fog and every man who ever sailed a colourless boat left hanging from the wardwood's own branches, where the next lot can watch him turn. 13 dead, and children among them, and we sat the whole morning long, weighing which northern boy wants the sterner scolding. "My Lord Oathcliff," Vale began, "while our own people burn in their beds. My Lord Oathcliff." Vale did not raise his voice much. He did not need to. He only tilted his head, the smallest degree, toward the girl seated on the step below the throne. And Oathcliff, following the tilt of it, saw Raeva, saw the flower crushed white-knuckled in her small hand, saw her jaw set hard as a bolt against her own face, and the old sworn steel of the man bent, all at once, into something nearly tender. He bowed his head to her, gruff. "Your pardon, Highness. These are no words for a lady's first court." "They are the only words for it," said the king quietly, "if she is to have mine one day." But he did not bid Oathcliff go on, and Raeva saw it plainly. Vale had cooled a thing near to boiling by no more than the naming of her in the room, and never once seemed to touch it. That is why father keeps him near. Lorin had waited, patient, for the heat to pass. Now he stepped softly into the cooler air it left behind, and his voice was reason itself. "No man in this room grieves those dead less than I do, your grace, but grief makes a poor treasurer." He opened his hands. 13 souls. Flame keep them and gather them home, but 13 souls to marauders in a bitter season, on a coast that has always bred bitter men. The South has had no rain in 2 summers now. When the crops fail and the granaries stand empty, hungry men take to boats and take what they can reach and call it war, because thief sits ill on the tongue. It is a tragedy, your grace. It is not an army. A small, delicate pause, and then so gently it might almost have passed for sympathy. "And I would ask, with all tenderness, whether the good Lord Morn, whose own marches have grown so very lean these last years, through no fault of his stewardship, none at all, might not be moved to see an enemy in a fog that a fuller granary would show him to be nothing but fog." It was so smoothly done that Raeva very nearly missed it. Then she caught the small tightening at the corner of Morn's jaw, and heard what Lorin had truly said, beneath the courtesy, "The marsh lord is poor, and poor men dream up monsters to explain their poverty." And a hot, clean, startling anger went through her on the old man's behalf. Because Morn had not lied. She was as certain of that as of her own name, and Lorin had just called him a frightened pauper to the king's face, and smiled the whole while he did it. Morn said nothing at all. He only looked at Lorin a moment, and then at the king, and let the silence carry the answer further than any word of his could have. "The drought is real," said Vael unhappily, into that silence. Ever the honest ledger, even when honesty served no one at the table. That much is not in question. The southern rolls are down a full third on the year. "There," said Lorin, as though the steward had agreed with him, which he had not. "And what would you have me do, Lorin?" said the king. "You are too careful a man to lay a village of dead children at my feet, only to leave me sitting on my hands above them. I would have you show the realm that its king is not afraid." Lorin smiled. "Not ships and gallows and grim northern faces. That is fear in armor, your grace, and the great houses will smell it on the wind. No, give them a tournament. The grandest this realm has seen in a generation. Summon every house to Emberfall, break lances, crown a champion, spill wine, let the whole realm, and every watching foreign envoy in it, see an Emberfall so little troubled by fog and rumor that it can turn round and feast." He turned his palms to the ceiling. Fear is a fire, your grace. You do not fight a fire with more fire. You starve it of its air. And Raeva watched her father decline to answer, and watched Lord Vale's face run some swift and pained arithmetic behind its eyes, and understood the truly dreadful thing about Lord Lorin, which was that he was not entirely wrong. "It is not the worst counsel I have had this day," the king allowed. "It is a ruinous one," said Vial, with respect to all present. "A tournament of that scale in a lean year. The lists, the purses, the feasting, the housing of every house, and every hanger-on it drags behind it. Your grace, I have not the coin. The southern rolls are down a third, as I have just this moment told you, and a treasurer cannot bake bread from the warm smell of an oven." "Then it is a great fortune," said Lorin, "that the coin need not come from your vault at all." Vial's eyes went narrow. "Meaning?" "The lords of the Isle have offered a gift." He said it as idly as a man remarking on the weather. "A gesture of friendship to the crown, in a difficult season. Unasked, unconditioned. They wish only to see Emberfall stand strong. A strong Emberfall being, when all is counted, so faithful a keeper of what it owes them." A modest smile. "I confess, I would call it generous." "I would call it strange," said Vial, "and I would see it counted upon a table before I set one candle of the crown's against it. A gift that no man asked for is a debt that no man has yet read the terms of. How much, Lorin? Show me the sum of it, or I'll not spend a mark on the strength of a promise." "You are a hard man to please, steward." "It is the one thing the crown pays me to be." And Lord Lorin, unhurried, entirely at his ease, reached beneath his fine dark coat and drew out a bag of coin and set it upon the council table between them, where it came to rest with the heavy, final, expensive sound of a great deal of gold. Raeva sat near enough to see it spill, and the coins that slid from the mouth of the bag were gold. The color of them sat a shade off, like honey held too long to a candle flame.